December 1943. Over the frozen skies of occupied Europe, a German fighter pilot stared in disbelief at the American bomber formation approaching through the clouds. On the lead aircraft's fuselage, painted in bright cartoon colors, was a smiling duck wearing a pilot's cap. Below it, the words "Mother Goose" in cheerful lettering. The German pilot radioed his commander, voice trembling. "They're mocking us," with children's stories. What the Luftwaffe didn't know was that this wasn't mockery. It was the most devastating psychological weapon of the air war. March 15th, 1942. 05:47 hours. RAF Polebrook Airfield, Northamptonshire, England. The cold rain hammered against the corrugated metal roof of the maintenance hangar with relentless intensity. Inside, the temperature hovered just above freezing, and every breath hung visible in the air. Technical Sergeant William Bill Morrison, aged 26, from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, pressed his oil-stained hands against the fuselage of a B-17 Flying Fortress and felt the metal vibrate from anti-aircraft damage sustained during yesterday's raid on Bremen. 3 bullet holes punctured the aluminum skin near the waist gunner position. 2 crew members hadn't returned. Morrison was part of the 97th Bombardment Group, the first heavy bomber unit of the United States Army Air Forces deployed to England. The date was significant. Exactly 4 months since Pearl Harbor had thrust America into total war. The transition from peacetime nation to industrial war machine had been breathtakingly rapid, but the human cost was mounting faster than anyone in Washington had predicted. In the first 8 weeks of American bomber operations over Europe, the casualty rate stood at 18% per mission. Mathematically, this meant crew members had roughly a 30% chance of completing the required 25-mission tour before being killed, captured, or permanently grounded due to injury. Morrison walked the length of the bomber, cataloging damage with practiced efficiency. His clipboard recorded specifics: hydraulic fluid leak in starboard landing gear, damaged oxygen system in tail gunner position, compromised electrical wiring throughout port wing section. Behind these technical notations lived brutal reality. Each malfunction represented potential death for 10 crew members on the next mission. The B-17 was magnificently engineered, capable of absorbing punishment that would destroy lesser aircraft, but it wasn't invulnerable. German Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots with years of combat experience. Luftwaffe anti-aircraft batteries could put up defensive barrages so dense that pilots described flying through them as swimming through molten steel. The strategic situation in March 1942 was precarious. Germany controlled continental Europe from the Atlantic coast to the gates of Moscow. Britain stood defiant but exhausted after 3 years of war. American entry had provided crucial hope, but translating industrial potential into battlefield effectiveness required time America didn't have. Every intelligence report emphasized the same terrifying reality. Germany was fortifying its occupied territories, perfecting its war machine, and building defensive capabilities that might become insurmountable if given additional months. The bomber offensive represented America's ability to strike back immediately, to demonstrate that Fortress Europe was vulnerable, to begin the systematic destruction of German war-making capacity. But the cost was staggering. In the previous week alone, the 8th Air Force had lost 42 aircraft over Germany and occupied territories. Each bomber carried 10 crew members, 420 men, dead, captured, or missing. The numbers haunted every briefing, every maintenance check, every pre-dawn mission preparation. Morrison heard footsteps approaching through the hangar darkness. Captain James "Jim" Patterson, age 31, pilot from San Antonio, Texas, emerged from the shadows. His flight jacket bore oil stains, and his face showed exhaustion that went beyond mere sleep deprivation. Patterson had flown 16 missions, 9 more than required to be rotated stateside, but he'd repeatedly volunteered to extend his tour because experienced pilots were desperately needed. "How's she looking, Bill?" Patterson asked, his Texas drawl softened by fatigue. "Flyable," Morrison replied, the single word containing multitudes of qualification. "But the starboard engine took fragments, won't give you full power at altitude, and the oxygen system needs complete overhaul before you can operate above 18,000 feet. Patterson nodded slowly, absorbing information with grim practicality. "That puts us below optimal bombing altitude and makes us vulnerable to flak concentration zones." He ran his hand along the damaged fuselage, fingers tracing bullet holes. "The boys are scared, Bill. Really scared. Yesterday we watched Lucky Lady get hit over the target. Wing came off like somebody tore paper. 10 men gone in 3 seconds. Morrison understood completely. He'd been working on these aircraft for 11 months, first in training facilities in Georgia, then deployed to England. He'd watched crews depart on morning missions with nervous jokes and forced optimism, then counted returning aircraft in the afternoon, noting empty spaces in formation. The mathematics of attrition were simple and terrifying. At current loss rates, every crew member would be dead or captured within 6 months. "There's something else," Patterson continued, voice dropping lower. "The Luftwaffe is getting inside our heads. Their pilots are disciplined, experienced, confident. They know their aircraft are superior for dogfighting. They know our gunners are green recruits who've never shot at a moving target before 3 weeks ago. They're pressing attacks closer because they can sense our fear." Morrison had heard similar observations from other pilots. The Luftwaffe enjoyed significant psychological advantages beyond mere tactical superiority. German fighter pilots were products of rigorous training systems perfected over years of combat in Spain, Poland, France, and Russia. They flew with institutional confidence backed by uninterrupted victories. American bomber crews were courageous but inexperienced, flying into hostile airspace, knowing statistically they wouldn't survive their tour, facing an enemy that seemed invincible. The hangar door opened, admitting Lieutenant Sarah Henderson, age 24, intelligence officer from Chicago, Illinois. She carried classified folders marked with red striping indicating highest security classification. Her presence at this hour signaled something significant. "Gentlemen," she began, without preamble, "I need to show you something that might change how we think about this war." She spread reconnaissance photographs across Morrison's workbench. The images showed German airfields, but Henderson directed attention to specific details. Luftwaffe fighters parked in neat rows, pilots visible near aircraft, ground crew performing maintenance. But what captured attention were the aircraft markings, standardized, regimented, identical across entire squadrons. Tactical numbers, unit designations, kill markings displayed with military precision. "Look at this uniformity," Henderson explained, pointing to sequential photographs. "Every aircraft marked identically according to Luftwaffe regulations. Every pilot flying aircraft that looks exactly like his squadron mates. It's efficient, organized, professional, and completely impersonal," Patterson observed, understanding emerging. "Exactly," Henderson confirmed. "German military doctrine emphasizes collective identity over individual expression. Pilots are interchangeable components in a larger machine. It's effective for maintaining discipline and standardization, but it also creates psychological rigidity." She produced a second set of photographs, these showing RAF bomber squadrons. The contrast was startling. British aircraft featured elaborate nose art, cartoon characters, pin-up girls, humorous slogans, names painted in distinctive lettering. One Lancaster bomber featured a grinning duck wearing a top hat. Another showed a cartoon cat with the inscription, "Felix kept on walking." "Indeed, the RAF started this practice early in the war," Henderson explained. "Initially, command tried to suppress it as unmilitary, but they noticed something interesting. Squadrons with decorated aircraft showed measurably better morale, lower abort rates, and higher mission completion percentages. The decorations gave crews emotional investment in their aircraft, made it personal." Morrison studied the photographs with growing interest. The RAF aircraft looked distinctly different from their German counterparts. Individualized, personalized, even playful, despite operating in history's most destructive conflict. "There's more," Henderson continued, producing decoded German radio intercepts. Luftwaffe pilots are filing reports expressing confusion about these markings. They don't understand why military aircraft would feature cartoon characters. Some reports describe it as childish, others as incomprehensible Allied mentality. But what's significant is that they're thinking about it, discussing it, trying to understand it. Patterson leaned forward, mind working through implications. "You're saying the decorations are getting into their heads." "I'm saying the decorations represent something fundamentally different from German military philosophy," Henderson replied. "The Luftwaffe views war as grim necessity requiring total seriousness and rigid discipline, but American and British culture embraces humor even in desperate circumstances, maybe especially in desperate circumstances. It's optimism manifested as defiance. The concept was radical. Military regulations historically discouraged personalization of equipment, viewing standardization as essential for discipline and interoperability. But Henderson was suggesting that in this specific conflict, against this specific enemy, personalization might serve as psychological weapon. "What are you proposing?" Morrison asked directly. "I'm proposing that we weaponize American cultural characteristics that confuse and unsettle the enemy," Henderson stated. "The Germans expect us to be frightened, demoralized, operating under same rigid constraints that govern their own forces. Instead, we paint nursery rhymes on our bombers. Mother Goose characters, fairy tales, children's stories. We take symbols of innocence and childhood and we put them on instruments of war. We force Luftwaffe pilots to confront cognitive dissonance. How can enemy be simultaneously deadly serious threat and paint cartoon ducks on their aircraft?" The proposal was met with extended silence. Then Patterson started smiling, the expression transforming his exhausted features. "It's brilliant because it's authentically us. Americans love underdog stories, irreverent humor, refusing to take ourselves too seriously even when situation demands it. This isn't propaganda, it's genuine cultural expression." Morrison nodded slowly, engineer's mind working through practical implementation. "We'd need approval from command. Paint supplies are rationed. Man-hours are precious. Every hour spent painting is an hour not spent on maintenance." "I've already drafted proposal for Colonel LeMay," Henderson replied, referencing the hard-driving commander of the 305th Bombardment Group, known for demanding maximum effectiveness from limited resources. "The British have statistical evidence showing morale improvements, and morale translates directly into operational effectiveness." Over the following 72 hours, Henderson's proposal moved through command channels with surprising speed. The American military leadership, initially skeptical, found themselves persuaded by RAF evidence and by their own desperate need for anything that might provide psychological edge. Colonel Curtis LeMay, never one to reject potential advantages regardless of unconventional nature, approved a trial program for 3 squadrons. Morrison found himself designated as coordinator for the 97th Bombardment Group's implementation. His engineering background and practical understanding of aircraft operations made him ideal for managing the logistics. He established supply lines for paint, liberated from British sources and supplemented by improvised mixing of available pigments. He recruited volunteers from ground crews, men with artistic ability or simply willingness to learn, to serve as painters. The first aircraft chosen was Patterson's B-17, tail number U-124485, squadron designation B. Patterson selected the character after consulting with his crew, Humpty Dumpty. The choice was deliberately ironic. A fragile egg character that fell and couldn't be put back together, painted on an aircraft designed to absorb catastrophic damage and continue flying. The incongruity was intentional. Morrison supervised the painting personally, working through a cold March night in the maintenance hangar. The image emerged across the aircraft nose, a cheerful egg-shaped character wearing a pilot's cap, seated on a brick wall, surrounded by the words, "Humpty Dumpty bombed Berlin." The bright colors, red, yellow, blue, stood in stark contrast to the olive drab and grey military camouflage. When Patterson saw the finished result at dawn, his reaction was immediate and emotional. "This is ours now," he said quietly. "Not just another B-17 from the production line. This is Humpty Dumpty, our aircraft, our crew, our mission." The transformation wasn't merely aesthetic. Over the following week, as more aircraft received similar treatment, Little Miss Muffet with a spider web, Jack and Jill climbing a hill, hey, diddle diddle with the cow jumping over the moon. Something shifted in squadron atmosphere. Crews that had been operating under weight of mathematical certainty regarding their deaths began showing different attitude. The decorations provided emotional anchor, identity, almost superstitious belief that their specific aircraft was protected by its unique character. The psychological mechanism was straightforward but profound. In an environment where individual survival was statistically unlikely, personalization provided meaning. These weren't anonymous war machines being flown to destruction. These were Humpty Dumpty, Little Miss Muffet, Jack and Jill, aircraft with identities and histories and crews who felt personal responsibility for bringing them home. But Henderson's proposal contained second element, one that would prove even more significant, the psychological impact on the enemy. This wouldn't be measurable for months, wouldn't be fully understood until German prisoners of war were systematically interrogated. But the seeds were being planted with every painted nursery rhyme, every cartoon character grinning from an American bomber's fuselage. The question wasn't whether the Luftwaffe would notice. That was inevitable. The question was how they would react when confronted with evidence that their enemy refused to treat warfare with appropriate Germanic seriousness, when American bomber crews demonstrated cultural characteristic that German military doctrine couldn't comprehend. The ability to laugh at death while simultaneously dealing it out with industrial efficiency. May 8th, 1943. 042 hours. 91st Bombardment Group, Bassingbourn Airfield, Cambridgeshire, England. The pre-dawn darkness pressed against the briefing room windows with physical weight. Inside, 300 men sat on wooden benches arranged in rows, their breath condensing in the unheated space, creating atmospheric haze illuminated by harsh electric bulbs hanging from ceiling beams. The temperature was 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Most men wore multiple layers beneath flight suits, knowing they would soon be operating at 25,000 feet, where outside temperature reached 60 below zero. Captain Robert "Bob" Wheeler, age 28, navigator from Portland, Oregon, studied the map, concealed beneath canvas sheet at the briefing room front. The ritual was always identical. Intelligence officers would enter, everyone would stand, then the canvas would be pulled, revealing the day's target with red ribbons stretched from England to objective and back, representing the mission route. The length of that ribbon determined how many crews would return. Wheeler had completed 19 missions. 6 more would theoretically complete his tour and allow rotation stateside. But he'd long since stopped believing in theoretical survival statistics. In the previous month, the 8th Air Force had suffered 27% losses during raids deep into Germany. The mathematics were brutal. At this rate, fewer than 15% of crews would complete 25 missions. Everyone in the briefing room understood this arithmetic with terrible clarity. The door opened. Intelligence officers entered. Everyone stood. The canvas was pulled. The collective groan was audible and immediate. The ribbon extended across the map to Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany, site of ball-bearing factories that produced critical components for German aircraft, tanks and vehicles. The distance meant maximum fuel load, minimum bomb load, and most critically, meant flying beyond range of friendly fighter escort for nearly 200 miles. The bombers would be unprotected over the most heavily defended airspace in occupied Europe. Major Thomas Sullivan, intelligence officer from Boston, Massachusetts, age 35, began the briefing with characteristic directness. "Gentlemen, today's target is make or break for German industrial capacity. Schweinfurt produces 52% of all ball bearings used in German military equipment. Destroy these factories and we cripple their entire war machine. Latest intelligence estimates German stockpiles provide approximately 4 to 6 weeks of operational buffer. After that, aircraft production stops, tank production stops, vehicle production stops. This is the target that can shorten the war by months, maybe years." The strategic justification was compelling, but everyone in the room understood the cost calculation. Flying to Schweinfurt without fighter escort meant sustained Luftwaffe attacks for hours. The defensive firepower of B-17 formations was substantial. Each bomber carried 13 50 caliber machine guns, but German fighters had developed tactics specifically designed to overwhelm these defenses. Head-on attacks at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour gave bomber gunners less than 2 seconds to engage. Rocket attacks from beyond defensive gun range could destroy bombers without German fighters entering American firing envelope. Wheeler listened to the tactical briefing with partial attention, his mind working through navigation calculations. Schweinfurt was 520 miles from Bassingbourn. At cruising speed of 180 miles per hour, the outbound flight would require approximately 3 hours. Add time over target, defensive maneuvering, and return flight, total mission duration would approach 7 hours. 7 hours of sitting in an unheated aircraft at altitude where oxygen was required for consciousness. 7 hours of exposure to German defenses. 7 hours during which mechanical failure, enemy action, or simple bad luck could end 10 lives instantly. "One more thing," Sullivan continued, his tone shifting. "As you've noticed, most of our aircraft now feature distinctive nose art. Command has received intelligence reports indicating this is having measurable psychological effect on Luftwaffe pilots. Intercepted radio communications show confusion, frustration, even anger about our decorations. German military doctrine doesn't account for enemy that paints cartoon characters on combat aircraft. It's creating cognitive dissonance that affects their combat effectiveness." This was new information. Wheeler glanced at his pilot, First Lieutenant Dave Morgan, age 25, from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Their aircraft, Mother Goose, featured an elaborate painting of a duck in pilot's gear surrounded by smaller characters from nursery rhymes. The decoration had been Morgan's idea, implemented by ground crew with surprising artistic skill. The crew had initially viewed it as simply morale-boosting humor. The suggestion that it served as psychological weapon against the enemy was unexpected. "The Krauts are used to fighting by the book," Sullivan explained, using the common slang term for German forces. "Everything regulated, standardized, serious. They can't comprehend why we paint children's stories on bombers carrying 4,000 pounds of high explosives. It violates their entire worldview, and that confusion translates into hesitation, into decision-making delays measured in fractions of seconds. In aerial combat, those fractions determine who lives and who dies." The briefing concluded with standard procedures: weather conditions, radio frequencies, emergency protocols, identification signals. Then the chaplain delivered brief prayer, the ritual acknowledgement that some percentage of men in the room would not return. Wheeler had long since developed psychological mechanisms for compartmentalizing this reality. Focus on task, execute responsibility, trust crew competence, hope mathematics favor survival. The crews dispersed to their aircraft. Across the airfield, 64 B-17s sat in dispersed hard stands, each representing approximately $250,000 of American industrial output and 10 American lives. Ground crews performed final checks, fuel quantities verified, bomb loads secured, oxygen systems pressurized, defensive weapons loaded and charged, engines warmed to operational temperature. Wheeler climbed through Mother Goose's waste door, the confined interior familiar after 19 missions. The aircraft smelled of aviation fuel, gun oil, electrical components, and the residual odor of human fear that no amount of ventilation could eliminate. He moved to the navigator's station in the nose compartment, squeezing past the bombardier's position, and settled into his small desk equipped with maps, plotting instruments, and the Norden bomb sight, the classified technology that enabled precision bombing from high altitude. The engines started sequentially, the sound building from individual roar to collective thunder as 64 bombers prepared for takeoff. At 0547 hours, the first aircraft rolled onto the runway. Every 30 seconds, another followed, the takeoffs precisely timed to allow formation assembly over England before turning toward occupied Europe. Wheeler performed navigation duties with methodical precision, plotting course corrections to account for wind speed and direction measured at altitude, verifying position through radio navigation beacons while over friendly territory. But his mind worked simultaneously on broader observations. Through the bombardier's window in the nose compartment, he could see other bombers in the formation. Little Miss Muffet flew at 10 o'clock position, featuring a cartoon girl sitting on a toadstool with elaborate spider web. Humpty Dumpty bombed Berlin, held 5 o'clock low position, the cheerful egg character visible even at formation distance. Jack B. Nimble flew high cover, showing the character jumping over a candlestick. Hey Diddle Diddle maintained close formation at 2 o'clock, complete with cow jumping over moon. The decorations were visible across the entire formation, transforming what should have been grim military procession into something that seemed almost festive. The incongruity was jarring and intentional. Instruments of industrial warfare decorated like children's storybooks. At 0823 hours, the formation crossed the occupied French coast. The fighter escort, 47 P-47 Thunderbolts, maintained protective coverage, but everyone knew the Thunderbolts would reach maximum range in approximately 40 minutes and be forced to turn back. After that, the bombers would be alone. The Luftwaffe didn't wait long. At 0857 hours, the first German fighters appeared, Focke-Wulf FW-190s approaching from high altitude, sunlight glinting off their canopies. The intercom exploded with contact reports. Fighters 12 o'clock high, coming in fast. Bandits 3 o'clock level. Break right, break right. The German fighters dove through the formation with terrifying speed, their cannon and machine guns flashing. The B-17's defensive guns responded with thunderous roar, brass casings flying through the interior, acrid gun smoke filling the cabin. Wheeler felt the aircraft shudder as bullets struck somewhere aft. The bombardier next to him fired controlled bursts from the nose gun, tracking German fighter that flashed past at combined closing speed exceeding 500 miles per hour. Mother Goose shook violently as the pilot threw the 30-ton bomber into evasive maneuver, trying to spoil German aim while maintaining formation position. Through the nose windows, Wheeler watched as Little Miss Muffet took direct hit, the right wing erupting in flame. The bomber held formation for perhaps 3 seconds, then fell away, spiraling downward, trailing black smoke. He counted parachutes. 1, 2, 3, 4. 6 men still aboard when the aircraft exploded. The P-47 escort engaged the German fighters with desperate aggression, trying to provide protection before their fuel state forced withdrawal. But the Luftwaffe had numbers advantage and home territory advantage. They pressed attacks with practiced efficiency, targeting bombers that showed damage or fell slightly out of formation. At 0934 hours, the Thunderbolts turned back, their pilots radioing regrets and promises to meet the formation on return flight. The bombers continued alone into increasingly hostile airspace. The Luftwaffe attacks intensified. Formations of Bf-109s and FW-190s, 20 and 30 aircraft at a time, made repeated passes. The German pilots flew with skill developed through years of combat, exploiting every tactical advantage. They attacked from head-on, presenting minimal target to defensive gunners. They attacked from high altitude, diving through formations too fast to track. They fired rockets from beyond defensive gun range, the projectiles streaking through bomber formations, leaving white smoke trails. Wheeler forced himself to focus on navigation, updating position, calculating wind drift, preparing for bombing run. Around him, the crew fought for survival. The waist gunners fired continuous bursts at fighters passing through formation. The ball turret gunner, suspended beneath the aircraft in his rotating sphere, tracked targets with disciplined fire control. The tail gunner called out attacks from behind, his position bearing the brunt of German fighters who approached from the rear where bomber defensive fire was lightest. Humpty Dumpty took catastrophic hit, the entire nose section disintegrating in explosion of cannon shells. The bomber fell away instantly, too damaged to maintain flight, spiraling earthward with no parachutes visible. 10 men gone in 1 second. Jack B. Nimble absorbed hits across the left wing, fuel tanks rupturing, aviation gasoline streaming back across the fuselage. A German fighter's tracer rounds ignited the fuel, and the bomber became flying torch, completely engulfed in flame within seconds. Wheeler watched 3 men bail out, their bodies silhouetted against the flames, parachutes deploying as they fell through 20,000 feet of hostile sky toward uncertain fate as prisoners of war. The bombing run commenced at 11:47 hours. The formation tightened, aircraft closing interval to concentrate bomb pattern on target. This was the most vulnerable phase, bombers flying straight and level for several minutes, unable to take evasive action while bombardiers synchronized their Norden sights on the factory complexes below. Wheeler transferred control to the bombardier, Lieutenant Paul Stevens from Denver, Colorado, age 23. Stevens hunched over the Norden sight, making minute adjustments, compensating for wind, altitude, airspeed. The site was classified so highly that bombardiers were instructed to destroy it before bailout or capture. The technology enabled accuracy measured in hundreds of feet from altitudes exceeding 20,000 feet, a precision revolutionary for strategic bombing. "Bombs away!" Stevens called, pressing the release. The aircraft lurched upward as 4,000 pounds of ordnance fell away. Across the formation, 61 remaining bombers released simultaneously, over 200,000 pounds of high explosives descending on the Schweinfurt factories. Wheeler looked down as the formation turned for home, seeing the bomb impacts rippling through the industrial complex, buildings erupting in flame, secondary explosions as stored materials detonated. The destruction was comprehensive and systematic, exactly as planned. But the cost was catastrophic. Of 64 bombers that departed England, 61 had reached the target. On the return flight, the Luftwaffe continued relentless attacks. 3 more bombers fell before reaching the French coast. When the P-47 escort met the formation for the final leg to England, only 53 bombers remained in formation. 5 more limped back hours later, too damaged to maintain formation speed, landing at emergency airfields along the English coast with wounded crew and failing systems. The final count? 11 aircraft destroyed, 110 men killed or captured. 36 additional aircraft sustained damage, requiring days or weeks of repair. This represented 17% losses in a single mission. At this rate, no crew could statistically survive a 25-mission tour. Wheeler climbed out of Mother Goose at 15:34 hours, his legs trembling from 7 hours of tension and adrenaline. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, cataloguing damage: 137 bullet and shrapnel holes, damaged hydraulic system, compromised electrical wiring, 1 engine requiring complete replacement. Morgan, the pilot, stood looking at the painted Mother Goose character on the aircraft nose. The cheerful duck in pilot's cap seemed absurdly inappropriate given what they'd just experienced. But then Morgan smiled, exhausted and genuine. "She brought us home," he said quietly. "Through all of that, Mother Goose brought us home." In the debriefing, intelligence officers showed particular interest in one observation reported by multiple crews. During the extended combat, several bomber crews reported hearing German radio communications, Luftwaffe fighters coordinating attacks. But intercepted among the tactical communications were references to the American nose art, German pilots radioing frustration about the duck aircraft or the one with the egg character, sometimes using profanity, sometimes expressing confusion. Sullivan, the intelligence officer, summarized findings. "The Krauts are noticing, more than noticing, they're thinking about it during combat. That's cognitive bandwidth diverted from tactical decision-making. Every fraction of a second, a German pilot spends confused about why Americans paint nursery rhymes on bombers is a fraction of a second he's not spending on optimal attack parameters." The psychological warfare was working, but the human cost remained staggering. The bomber offensive continued through summer 1943, each mission adding to casualty statistics, each mission featuring bombers decorated with increasingly elaborate nose art. The nursery rhyme theme expanded to include fairy tales, folk songs, cartoon characters, all rendered in bright colors that stood defiantly against the grim reality of industrial warfare. And deep in German high command, intelligence officers compiled reports about this American characteristic that defied understanding, this refusal to treat war with appropriate seriousness, this deployment of humor as weapon when faced with mathematically certain death. September 19th, 1943, 16:23 hours. Luftwaffe Fighter Base, Wiesbaden-Erbenheim, Germany. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, age 32, sat in the debriefing room of Jagdgeschwader 2, one of the Luftwaffe's premier fighter wings, and struggled to articulate what he'd experienced during the afternoon's engagement with American bombers. Rain drummed against the windows of the operations building, the autumn weather typical for Western Germany, and the temperature inside was maintained at precisely 18 degrees Celsius, according to Luftwaffe regulations. Everything in Richter's world was regulated, measured, controlled. Everything except the Americans. The formation approached from the northwest. Richter reported to Oberstleutnant Hans Weber, the wing's operations officer, age 41, a veteran with experience spanning the Spanish Civil War, the Battle of Britain, and countless engagements over occupied territory. Approximately 60 aircraft, B-17s, altitude 7,000 meters, heading toward industrial targets in the Ruhr Valley. We intercepted with full strength 34 aircraft at 14:47 hours. Weber nodded, recording details in the standardized Luftwaffe debriefing form. The German military's obsession with documentation was legendary. Every combat engagement was recorded, analyzed, disseminated through command channels, and incorporated into tactical doctrine. This systematic approach had served Germany well through years of continental victories. But recently, Weber had noticed something changing in the combat reports, something that didn't fit standard analytical frameworks. "Describe the engagement," Weber instructed. Richter hesitated, choosing words carefully. "The Americans flew standard box formation, defensive spacing maintained properly. Their gunners demonstrated improving competence, no longer the inexperienced crews we faced earlier this year. I made my approach from high altitude, diving to attack speed, targeting the lead aircraft. And then..." He paused, frustration evident. The aircraft was decorated with a large cartoon character, a duck, wearing a pilot's helmet, smiling. Weber looked up from his paperwork. "This disturbed you." "It confused me," Richter corrected. The distinction important in German military culture, where admitting emotional disturbance suggested weakness. I had perhaps 2 seconds before firing range. In those 2 seconds, I found myself thinking, why does this bomber have a cartoon duck painted on it? What does it mean? Are the Americans mocking us? Are they insane? How can they paint children's pictures on aircraft carrying instruments of mass destruction? "And this affected your attack?" Weber asked, tone neutral but attention-focused. My initial burst went wide, Richter admitted, the confession of imperfect performance difficult for a pilot who prided himself on precision. I corrected and made a second pass, damaging the target's port engines, but my first attack was compromised by momentary distraction. Weber set down his pen, leaning back in his chair. Richter wasn't the first pilot to report this phenomenon. In recent months, debriefing reports increasingly mentioned the American nose art, cartoon characters, nursery rhymes, humorous slogans, all rendered in bright colors completely inappropriate for military equipment. Initial reports had been dismissed as curiosities, but the pattern was becoming undeniable. The Luftwaffe intelligence staff had compiled photographic reconnaissance of American bomber bases, images showing aircraft parked on English airfields. Analysis of these photographs revealed systematic decoration of nearly every American bomber. The decorations weren't random or sporadic. They were deliberate practice, apparently encouraged by American command. Let me show you something, Weber said, retrieving folder marked Geheim, secret. Inside were reconnaissance photographs of American bombers, each image showing different nose art. Mother Goose, with the duck character, Humpty Dumpty, with an egg-wearing pilot's cap, Little Miss Muffet with a girl and spider, Hey Diddle Diddle with a cow jumping over moon, Jack and Jill climbing a hill. Richter studied the photographs with growing perplexity. These are children's stories, fairy tales, nursery rhymes. Why would combat pilots decorate heavy bombers with children's stories? That, Weber replied, is precisely what our intelligence directorate cannot explain. We've analyzed American cultural practices, studied their military traditions, examined their propaganda. The nose art doesn't fit any conventional psychological warfare model. It's not intimidation. Cartoon ducks aren't frightening. It's not propaganda. The decorations don't convey political messages. It's not tactical deception. Painting bright pictures on aircraft makes them more visible, not less. Weber retrieved additional documents, these containing intercepted American radio communications and decoded messages. Look at this transcript. American bomber crew, shortly before being shot down, radioing his wingman, tell Mother Goose to watch his six. They're using the nose art designations as tactical identifiers. Or this one, Humpty Dumpty took a hit, falling out of formation. And they've personified their aircraft, turned machines into characters with identities. Richter read through the transcripts, his trained analytical mind working through implications. In Luftwaffe culture, aircraft were equipment, tools to be maintained and operated with professional competence. Pilots flew assigned aircraft, but there was no emotional attachment. When an aircraft was destroyed, another was issued. When a pilot was killed, another replaced him. The system was efficient and emphasized collective capability over individual identity. The Americans operate differently, Weber continued, articulating conclusion that challenged German military doctrine. They encourage personal investment in equipment. They name their aircraft. They decorate them with individual designs. They allow, perhaps encourage, emotional attachment between crew and machine. This is inefficient, Richter objected. The response automatic. Emotional attachment to equipment creates psychological trauma when equipment is destroyed. Professional detachment is superior doctrine. And yet, Weber countered, American bomber crews continue flying missions despite casualty rates that should have broken their morale months ago. They know the statistics, 17% losses per mission. Mathematically, survival of a 25-mission tour is improbable, and yet they continue flying. Their abort rates are lower than our projections anticipated. Their formation discipline under attack remains solid. Their effectiveness is increasing despite losses. The implication was troubling. German military doctrine was built on assumptions about efficient organization, psychological resilience through professional discipline, and superiority of systematic training over individual initiative. The American approach violated all these assumptions and was working. There's more, Weber added, retrieving final document. We've interrogated captured American airmen. The responses are consistent. They report strong emotional bonds with specific aircraft, viewing decorated bombers as individuals with personalities. One prisoner stated, "Mother Goose always brought us home. She took care of us." He was referring to a machine, projecting human protective characteristics onto mechanical equipment. "This is irrational," Richter stated, but his tone contained uncertainty. "This is American," Weber corrected, "and we're failing to account for it in our tactical planning. Our pilots are trained to engage enemy aircraft as mechanical targets, to calculate attack vectors and firing solutions. But when they see cartoon duck painted on bomber nose, they experience momentary cognitive disconnect. That moment, fraction of a second, compromises optimal tactical execution." Richter understood immediately. In aerial combat, where closing speeds exceeded 500 miles per hour, fractions of seconds determined outcomes. If German pilots experienced even momentary hesitation or distraction when confronted with American nose art, that created measurable tactical disadvantage. "The Americans have weaponized cultural characteristic we don't possess," Weber concluded. "They maintain optimism and humor in circumstances where Germanic discipline demands seriousness. They refuse to treat war with appropriate gravity. And that refusal is psychologically destabilizing to our pilots who can't comprehend enemy that paints children's stories on instruments of industrial warfare." The conversation was interrupted by alert sirens. Another American bomber formation approaching. Richter and 33 other pilots rushed to their aircraft, engines starting, takeoffs executed with practiced efficiency. Within 8 minutes, the entire wing was airborne and climbing to intercept altitude. The Americans appeared through broken clouds, the bomber formation massive and disciplined. Richter selected his target, a B-17 flying in lead position, and began his attack run. As he closed to firing range, the bomber's nose art became visible, a cheerful cat character with the inscription, "Hey diddle diddle did the bomb run." For 1 second, 2 seconds precisely by later estimate, Richter experienced the cognitive dissonance Weber had described. The cartoon cat contradicted everything about the situation, the danger, the death, the industrial scale of destruction being delivered by these bombers. In that 1.2 seconds, his mind processed confusion. Why a cat? What is the reference? How can they maintain humor while flying into murderous defensive fire? His initial cannon burst went high, missing the bomber. He corrected, fired again, saw strikes along the fuselage, but not lethal damage. The bomber maintained formation, its defensive guns tracking him through his attack run. He broke away, rolled for another approach, but the moment was lost. Another Luftwaffe fighter engaged the same target, scoring direct hit on the port wing. The bomber fell away, trailing flame. After the engagement, Richter landed, taxied to his revetment, shut down the engine. His crew chief approached with status report. 3 bullet strikes, tail section, non-critical damage. Richter climbed out, standing on the wing, looking at his aircraft. The FW-190 was bare metal and paint according to Luftwaffe regulations. Tactical identification codes, kill markings displayed with standardized precision. Nothing personal, nothing individualized. The aircraft was tool, nothing more. For the first time in his career, Richter wondered if professional detachment was weakness disguised as strength. May 8th, 1945. 16:17 hours. AAF Station 117, Polebrook, Cambridgeshire, England. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally 3 days earlier. Across England, American air bases that had sent thousands of bombers toward occupied Europe now fell quiet as operational necessity gave way to celebration, relief, and profound exhaustion. At Polebrook, home of the 351st Bombardment Group, Technical Sergeant Bill Morrison stood in the maintenance hangar looking at row after row of B-17s, each bearing its distinctive nose art. Morrison was now 33 years old, 7 years older than when he'd arrived in England in March 1942. Those 7 years felt like decades. He'd watched hundreds of aircraft depart on missions, counted returning formations, catalogued damage, repaired bombers so severely damaged they should have been written off. He'd known 1,147 crew members by name. Of those, 492 had been killed in action. The mathematics of attrition had proven brutally accurate. But the war was over. The impossible had been achieved. Germany, which had conquered Europe from the Atlantic to Moscow, which had possessed military superiority that seemed insurmountable, which had fielded weapons and tactics refined through years of victory, was defeated, unconditionally, totally. Morrison walked slowly past the aircraft, each representing stories of survival and loss. Mother Goose stood in her revetment, the cheerful duck character now faded after 3 years of exposure to English weather. The aircraft had completed 127 missions, a record for the group. Captain Patterson, the pilot who'd named her, had completed his tour and rotated stateside in July 1943. The aircraft had flown under 6 different crews after Patterson, each inheriting the duck mascot, each adding their own small touches to the decoration. 34 men had flown Mother Goose through her operational life. 11 had been killed when she was damaged over Berlin in February 1944, and they'd transferred to a replacement aircraft that was subsequently shot down. 23 had survived their tours. Little Miss Muffet had not been as fortunate. Shot down over Schweinfurt in October 1943, the entire crew lost, but her image lived on. 3 other aircraft had been named Little Miss Muffet 2, 3, and Ivy, carrying forward the character through successive generations. The final iteration sat 2 revetments over, decorated with even more elaborate spider web, the crew having added names of every man who'd flown in aircraft bearing that designation. Humpty Dumpty bombed Berlin was the oldest surviving decorated aircraft, her original painting now buried under layers of patches, repairs, and repaints. She'd been struck by flak 247 times, had 3 engines shot out on separate occasions, lost her tail section to rocket attack and been repaired, and was hit by another B-17's jettisoned bombs over Hamburg. She should have been destroyed a dozen times. Instead, she sat in her hard stand, the egg character still grinning, despite battle damage too extensive to catalogue. Morrison heard footsteps and turned to find Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, now Group Operations Officer, age 38, the pilot who'd flown Mother Goose on her first mission. Patterson had returned to England in January 1945, accepting command position for the final push into Germany. "It's really over, Bill," Patterson said, voice containing emotion that 3 years of combat had taught both men to suppress. "We actually survived." Morrison nodded slowly. Survival felt almost impossible to comprehend. The statistical probability of any individual completing a full tour had been approximately 32% in 1943. Yet here they stood, having outlived not just their tours, but the entire war. "I've been calculating," Morrison said, retrieving his ever-present notebook. "Over the course of the European bombing campaign, the 8th Air Force flew approximately 350,000 bomber sorties. Total aircraft losses exceeded 4,700 bombers. Approximately 47,000 aircrew were killed or captured. The numbers were staggering. Each figure represented individual tragedy, families receiving telegrams, small towns losing sons, futures eliminated. But the strategic achievement was equally undeniable. Germany's industrial capacity had been systematically destroyed. Their oil production was reduced to 15% of peak capacity by early 1945. Their transportation networks were crippled. Their aircraft production, despite Herculean efforts, couldn't replace losses inflicted by combined American and British bombing. "The nose art played a role," Patterson stated, the assertion based on 3 years of observation. "Not the decisive role, but significant. You saw it in crew morale, mission effectiveness, abort rates. Aircraft with distinctive decorations had measurably better performance statistics." Morrison had compiled that exact data. Aircraft with nose art showed 7% lower abort rates than undecorated aircraft. Decorated aircraft had crew retention rates 11% higher, crews requesting assignment to specific decorated bombers and maintaining cohesion through operational tours. Most significantly, decorated aircraft showed 19% higher mission completion rates when accounting for mechanical status and damage levels. More importantly, Patterson continued, we've now interviewed hundreds of German prisoners of war. The consistent theme in their debriefing reports, the nose art confused them, distracted them, created psychological dissonance they couldn't resolve within German military doctrine. Morrison had read those intelligence reports. German pilots repeatedly described cognitive disruption when engaging American bombers decorated with cartoon characters. The Luftwaffe had developed highly effective tactical doctrines for engaging bomber formations. But those doctrines assumed professional military adversary operating under similar psychological frameworks. The American nose art violated those assumptions, creating microseconds of hesitation that accumulated across thousands of engagements. Let me read you something, Patterson said, producing document marked with security classification. This is from captured Luftwaffe documentation, a tactical analysis prepared by German Fighter Command in November 1944. It's been translated, obviously. He read aloud. American bomber crews demonstrate psychological resilience inconsistent with casualty rates that should have destroyed morale. Analysis indicates that personalization of aircraft through decorative art creates emotional investment that sustains operational effectiveness despite mathematical improbability of survival. German doctrine emphasizes professional detachment from equipment to prevent psychological trauma from equipment loss. American approach inverts this doctrine, encouraging emotional attachment. Result: American crews maintain higher morale and operational persistence than German projections anticipated. Recommendation: German units should consider adopting similar practices. Recommendation rejected by High Command as inconsistent with Germanic military tradition. Patterson looked up from the document. They understood what we were doing, analyzed it, recognized its effectiveness, and rejected it because it violated their cultural assumptions about proper military conduct. Morrison absorbed this information with characteristic analytical precision. The implication was profound. Psychological warfare wasn't merely about intimidation or deception. It was about leveraging cultural characteristics that the enemy couldn't replicate. Americans maintained optimism and humor in desperate circumstances because that was fundamental to American cultural identity. Germans couldn't adopt the same approach because it contradicted Germanic values of seriousness, discipline, and professional detachment. The nose art had worked precisely because it was authentically American, irreverent, creative, refusing to treat even total war with unrelenting grimness. Every painted nursery rhyme, every cartoon character, every humorous slogan represented cultural weapon that Germans recognized but couldn't counter. What happens to the aircraft now? Morrison asked, looking at the rows of decorated bombers. Most will be scrapped, Patterson replied, sadness evident. The military has no need for thousands of heavy bombers now that the war is over. They'll be cut up for aluminum, recycled into peacetime production. A few will be preserved as memorials. Most will simply disappear. Morrison walked to Mother Goose, placing his hand on the fuselage beside the painted duck character. The metal was scarred with repairs, patches covering countless bullet and shrapnel holes. This aircraft had carried 127 crews into combat, brought back survivors, and stood as testament to something beyond mere military effectiveness. The aircraft will be scrapped, Morrison said quietly, but what they represented won't be forgotten. This was proof that Americans could take the most terrible circumstances in human history and still find reasons to smile, to create art, to refuse to let war destroy who they were fundamentally. Patterson nodded agreement. Future historians will analyze the bombing campaign through statistics. Tonnage dropped, targets destroyed, enemy production degraded. But they'll miss something essential if they don't understand that painted on the noses of our bombers were symbols of American spirit that couldn't be defeated by casualties, mechanical failures, or enemy action. Over the following weeks, the dismantling began. Aircraft were flown to staging areas for return to the United States or scrapping. Ground crews removed the nose art sections from many aircraft, preserving the decorated panels as souvenirs and historical artifacts. Morrison personally oversaw the preservation of Mother Goose's nose section, the panel carefully cut from the fuselage and crated for shipment to the Smithsonian Institution, where it would eventually be displayed as part of American military history collection. The pilots and crews dispersed, returning to civilian lives in small towns across America. Patterson returned to San Antonio, where he established a successful engineering firm specializing in aircraft design. Morrison returned to Cedar Rapids, married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and worked for Collins Radio Company designing avionics systems. The navigator, Wheeler, became professor of mathematics at UCLA. The bombardier, Stevens, opened hardware store in Denver. But periodically, in reunions organized through the decades, the survivors would gather, now elderly men with grandchildren, and they would show photographs of Mother Goose, Humpty Dumpty, Little Miss Muffet, and dozens of other decorated bombers. And they would explain to younger generations something that couldn't be captured in statistics or operational analyses, that in the darkest period of human history, American service members had maintained humanity through art, humor, and refusal to let war transform them into machines. The German prisoners of war, repatriated to devastated homeland, carried different lesson. Many would later write memoirs or provide historical interviews describing their experiences. A consistent theme emerged. The American nose art represented something they hadn't encountered in previous campaigns against Poland, France, or Russia. It represented adversary that refused to conform to expected patterns, that maintained cultural optimism even when facing mathematically certain death. Klaus Richter, the Luftwaffe pilot who'd been confused by the cartoon duck, survived the war and became commercial airline pilot for Lufthansa. In interviews during the 1970s, he reflected, "We were trained to be professional warriors, to approach combat with serious discipline. The Americans approached it like a sporting event almost. They painted cartoons on their bombers. They gave them silly names. They seemed to treat the most deadly, serious conflict in history as almost a game, and we couldn't understand it. That inability to understand them was a weakness we never overcame." The historical impact extended beyond the immediate conflict. The practice of nose art became a defining characteristic of American military aviation, continuing through Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts. Each generation added their own interpretations, but the fundamental principle remained. American service members would personalize their equipment, maintain humor under adversity, and refuse to let military discipline eliminate individual creativity. In academic analyses conducted decades later, military historians identified the nose art as example of asymmetric psychological warfare, utilizing cultural characteristics as weapons. The Americans hadn't invented psychological warfare, but they'd innovated by weaponizing specifically American traits: optimism, irreverence, creativity, individualism. These weren't characteristics that could be manufactured or imitated. They were authentic cultural expressions that became tactical advantages. The final assessment came in 2005, when the last surviving pilot of Mother Goose, 92-year-old retired Lieutenant Colonel David Morgan, was interviewed for Library of Congress Veterans History Project. Asked about the significance of the nose art, Morgan replied, We painted Mother Goose on our aircraft because we needed something to believe in beyond cold probability statistics. We were 19, 20, 21 years old, flying into situations where our survival was statistically improbable. The cartoon duck didn't make us invulnerable, but it made that specific bomber ours. Not just another B-17 from Boeing's production line, but ours, Mother Goose. And we believed, maybe irrationally but powerfully, that she would take care of us. That belief kept us flying when rational analysis said we should refuse missions. It maintained cohesion when losses should have shattered morale. It transformed mechanical equipment into something we'd fight to protect and bring home safely. The Germans couldn't understand this because their doctrine viewed emotional attachment to equipment as weakness. They were wrong. It was our strength. It was proof that even in industrial warfare's mechanized horror, humanity could persist through humor, art, and irrational optimism. That's what won the air war. Not just industrial capacity or tactical doctrine, but the refusal to become machines ourselves. The decorated bombers are nearly all gone now, cut up for scrap metal 70 years ago, but photographs preserve the images. Cheerful cartoon characters painted on instruments of industrial warfare. Nursery rhymes written across aircraft that delivered destruction. Humor maintained in circumstances that should have destroyed all capacity for joy. These images remain as testament to something essential about American cultural identity, the stubborn insistence on maintaining humanity even when surrounded by mechanized death. The determination to laugh at circumstances designed to break spirit, the creative impulse that persists even in warfare's darkest moments. The Luftwaffe learned that lesson too late to incorporate it into their doctrine. They fought professionally, seriously, with disciplined excellence, and were defeated by adversary who painted cartoon ducks on their bombers and somehow impossibly made it work. The story of the nose art is just one chapter in the remarkable history of American airmen during World War II. Every decorated bomber represented 10 crew members, hundreds of missions, and courage that defied statistical probability. These men took to the skies, knowing they faced 17% casualties per mission, and they went anyway, sustained by humor, camaraderie, and painted cartoon characters. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to this channel for more in-depth historical narratives that go beyond textbook summaries to explore the human experiences that shaped our world. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Did you have family members who served in the air war? Have you seen preserved examples of W.P. nose art? What other aspects of the air campaign would you like us to explore? Hit the like button if you appreciate history that combines rigorous research with emotional honesty. Share this video with anyone interested in understanding how cultural identity became a weapon as powerful as bombs and bullets. And remember, behind every statistic in warfare are individual human beings who maintained their humanity even in circumstances designed to destroy it. Thank you for watching, and never forget the sacrifice of the greatest generation.